Well, we have one of our mappers who uses Slack and had been working on a map. At one point, pinged Slack saying they were looking for help with stats, with SNA type stats with their network map, and I suggested that Maya Townsend was really good at that, and so that person reached out to Maya to get some advice and for some coaching. And then a few weeks later, Maya and I happened to be chatting, and Maya said, "Oh, this person talked to me," and then Maya expressed some concerns because she felt like the map that this person had a number of things in it that were different from a classic SNA that made it hard to do stats on it. And so we sort of talked about that, and my initial response in our conversation was, "Oh yeah, that happens all the time. It's a different animal, but people expect it to be the old animal, and so that's always a challenge," which was kind of a knee-jerk response on my part. And we talked a little bit about it, and I then wanted to write about it, and I realized later that week as I was going to write about it, I realized I didn't ask Maya a single thing about what was really challenging, and I just made my own assumptions based on my own experience. But Maya is a person who's been doing SNA analysis for a long time, and I'm sure sees it more clearly, or had a clear insight into what the challenges were than I did, and I was just making a knee-jerk reaction. And so then I wanted to follow up with Maya and say, "Hey, I didn't really probe very well there, and I would like to do, I would like an opportunity to try that again. Would you mind?" And she said, "Sure." So that's how we got here. So that's kind of the background. And so what I'd like to do is ask, just to be able to sort of interview Maya again, or like ask her the questions I didn't ask her, and then as you guys have your own questions, to jump in and ask those questions, just so that it can become an exploration of the sort of the difference of social system mapping from social network analysis in terms of evaluation and analysis, and less in terms of what goes into it and how do we make it in the process, but sort of a way of engaging with the outcome. Does that work for everybody? Okay. So, and I don't have any questions. I figured out ahead of time. I was just sort of, so I was curious, what was that person looking for that you felt like you weren't challenged by?
So yeah, let me give a little bit of context also.
Yeah.
Part of, I think, my concern about this is that, and it's the flip side of having such a wonderful tool like this be available to everyone, which is that it's available to anyone and anyone can use it. And so they can jump in without really knowing anything about SNA or social system mapping. And so this person had dove in and done a beautiful job. I mean, created beautiful maps, was really like new Kumu, like up and down and back and forth. But I think what this person wasn't clear of, and I think it's not just this one person, I think this is about the field, and what the field isn't really aware of is that there are things that you can do in an SNA that you can't do with a social system map. And people get confused. They think they can do the same things. And I think part of it is, I mean, one of the major first defining or boundary setting pieces for me is around the population. And that usually in a, I always call it an ONA, which is why I'm getting a little tripped up with the SNA, an organization network map or social system map or social network map. We know who the population is. We know who's in, we know who's out of that. And so what we can do is we can say, if there are 100 people, this is the response rate we need. And once we get this response rate, then we can run it through the algorithms to find out, density in betweenness and, eigenvector and all those good things. And those can tell us some things about the network as a whole. In a social system map, we don't know where the boundaries of the population are because it is a larger ecosystem, right? And part of what we're doing is discovery. But what that means is that we can't use the SNA metrics in the same way. In fact, I don't know what metrics you can use. I mean, there's certainly some things, well, I'm now thinking about another technique I've used, and there are some things you can do, but you can't use the metrics in the same way. And I think that's one of the places where people get tripped up, is thinking that they can. And also the other concern that I have, well, I'll add one more thing, and then we can open it up and talk more, is that is what kind of conclusions can people draw? So one of the conversations I had with this person was around, okay, so you have this amount of data and you've got some great data, but you maybe have 10% of what you might want to have in this data. And so what kind of conclusions can you draw, given the fact that the data is so very incomplete? And I think that was one of the things that she was struggling with, and I struggled a little bit along with her. And that's one of the things that I'd like to really open up to this group, is what kind of conclusions can you draw from a social system map? And really, what are some of the best practices for using them? So let me stop there and see if that's enough to get us started. So, reactions, thoughts?
Anyone?
Well, I'm thinking just an orientation, because people might not have the same level of understanding about SNA, is maybe you can give an example how a bounded map and getting complete survey data allows you to draw ego nets and whole network kinds of things and conclusions from it, versus when you only have, way impartial information.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll give an example of an organization network map that I actually published an article on in People and Strategy, just because that's very much out in the public realm. And what it was an organization network map of a global public affairs department. And so what we were able to do, we were able to say who are all of the people in this global public affairs department. We reached out also to some allies, important allies. We sent out a network survey to all of the folks in that system. We got a very high response rate. And then as a result of that, we were able to run statistics to show, for example, how dense the network was.
Whoops.
What? What?
You stopped for a second.
You froze up.
Oh, I did?
In the middle of that sentence.
Can you just
Okay.
repeat that last sentence?
Sure. So what we were able to do is we were able to learn how quickly does information flow through the system. We were able to identify critical connectors, the people who had disproportionate influence over the whole. We were able to look at which functions in the organization were stronger than others. So for example, was there more activity happening around problem solving or innovation? Or did one of the others need more attention? We were also able to use the maps to coach leaders, to help them say, this is the area that you are responsible for leading. Is this area doing what you want it to do? How are you positioned in that? Are you positioned in the way that your network needs you to be positioned? So there were a number of things we could do with that. And I'm just to give a little bit. So that was an organization network map, or a social system, or a social network map, bounded population, very different from a social system map.
So can I ask a question? Oh, go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say, can you, one thing that's intrigued me a long time ago that you said is I usually build 8 maps, asking a different relational question for each one, and then mine those as time goes on and as their maturity progresses. What are some of the relational questions you asked in that map, or just typically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's always the basic 5 that I start off with, and then add based on the organization. But there's always the routine one. So just how does work tend to happen? You know, who do you go to get your ordinary work done? There's one around social. Who do you go to when you want to relax, let off steam, find out what's going on? There's another one around expertise. Who do you go to for expert knowledge related to work? There's one about problem solving. So who do you go to when there's something not working and you need to figure out how to solve it? And then innovation. Who do you go to when you want to talk about a brand new idea? When you're thinking of trying something new, who do you reach out to talk about that? And then depending on the client, we can talk about decision making. Mentoring tends to be another one. Energy is another one. So those are some of the ones that naturally show up.
Advice.
That tends to fall under mentoring advice, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So can I get some clarification? Because I think what I heard you say, Maya, is that the social systems map is unbounded, and that's what part of the challenge is in running social network analysis?
That's my sense. I'm open to thinking that some of them are bounded, but most of the ones that I've worked with have been unbounded. What's your experience?
Well, I mean, we've been calling our map a social systems map, and it's definitely it has some boundaries, I feel like, to it. Mm-hmm. But we're also a little bit different. I guess in my mind, like, a social systems map has more complexity to it. There's, like, you know, more dimensions and a little bit more deeper understanding of what is happening in that system versus other maps where I've seen a little bit more simplicity, I think, in terms of that visualization.
Could you say more about that? Yeah, could you say more about that in terms of in what ways more dimensions and what way more complexity?
Yeah, well, you know, like some of the things that Christina and I are thinking about in terms of our map, you know, is some of the things that we're doing already, you know, like looking at where people are showing up, obviously, like mapping the relationships between people. But some of our aspiration is also to be able to, like, overlay a systems map, you know, of our, like, equitable deep decarbonization framework, for example, as part of that. Mm-hmm. We're looking at mapping ripple effects that happen throughout the network, you know, looking at mapping where resources are flowing. And so it's like, for me, I guess it's been like a combination of all these different layers that then give us a social systems map, because it does have so many dimensions to it. But I guess, you know, I feel like I'm also early in this learning journey. I'm kind of looking at Christine, even though she can't see me, and just waiting to see if she has any opinions about this.
Yeah, and the one thing that I want to put in there is that I think actually those three things you just mentioned, mapping ripple effects, mapping where resources flow, doing the overlays, those are all things that can also be done with organization network maps. And so, I don't know, maybe we need to rethink the definition of social system map. And I'm curious about Christine's take on this, because in my mind, one of the differences is that an ONA was more bounded, or an SNA was more bounded. You know who was in and who was out. And a social system map was much more exploratory, sort of like getting a sense of what the terrain was. So I'm looking forward to having my impressions be updated. So how would you describe it, Christine?
Well, I think that, I mean, so, how do I say this? I think that technically much of what's doable in one context is doable in another context. And I think it's more about the underlying, like, intentional, the intention in the approach that is the major difference. But then, so yes, I think in an SNA you can add, you know, you can add, for instance, things like, well, I don't know if you can do this in the tools you've used, but things like the offers and the asks, right? That's another dimension of what's in the network. What are the asks? So that's a sort of an asset map dimension. Or if you're looking at what strategies are people using for their social change efforts, or what what elements of the system, of a systemic analysis that they've done, what elements are people either working on or impacted by. I believe you could set up some of that in an ONA type map. I never see anybody focusing on those things. I never see anybody talking about, I mean, what we see is looking at the social system structure, the social system, the patterns of the net, the patterns of the network in relation to the interpersonal relationships, without looking at those other patterns and how they might be playing into it or not. So that's one thing that I think a social system map ultimately is a difference. Another, so what I've been sort of defining social system maps is having multiple layers, and keeping in mind that, like, what Sarah and I are doing at the moment is not entirely currently doable in sumApp, that we're moving towards adding these more layers. But for instance, lots of our clients want to know both the network relationships of the people and the organization. So we're trying to figure out how we can make both of those doable within sumApp. And then things like people's working on, like the working groups that they're part of, what their relationship is to various working groups. Like, I used to work on it, I do work on it, I lead it. And then things like, event attendance, who comes to what, so that we can try to begin to measure how do those events change things. And then the whole over time, the dimension of being able to have time frames, which some of that is already in sumApp and some of those things I just said aren't. But so how I've been starting to describe it is it's multiple layers of system map, network map, asset map, stakeholder map. Another piece that often goes into network maps or the social system maps is elements of identity, maybe not, depending on where people are at with their comfort levels around dealing with that, but certainly the perspectives, the stakeholder perspectives that the different players have. So you can start to look at the relationships, but the relationships in all these different kind of contexts. And in a way that centers the human reporting. So that's one of the things that sometimes I see people do maps, and they've got all these elements and they've maybe got people in the maps, but they're not asking the people themselves. They're just extrapolating based on various things they've pulled from elsewhere, or at any rate, we're sort of trying to focus on what do the people need to know about each other, and what do they say about themselves and their relationships with each other, as opposed to other ways of getting information and examining a network or a system, a social system. So that's a sort of a jumping into it and sort of thrashing around.
Yeah.
If I could add something that maybe is piling on there, but the framework that I see in ONA and SNA is a real focus on the network dynamics, the kinds of, and taken from the science. So how can you reason about networks based on the relationship structure? And so you need certain kinds of metrics to be able to see that structure. Bounding helps with that, and so forth. SSM, I think of as the focus is on, as you said, the human side of it, so that you're really digging into people seeing each other and using the map from a participatory aspect, so that people's agency at every entity, the agency is being amplified because of what the tool is. And so far, I've only seen ONA, SNA kinds of things where management comes in, looks at the top, looks at the structure, and says, okay, so now we want to do some macro changes that move this. And yeah,
I think there's really something to that, Jim. I like that. I think in my work, I'm always trying with the SNA to engage people in doing collective meaning making of it. And I think that this is where SSM is ahead, and that that's centered in social system mapping right from the very beginning, and that it's intended to be a collective exercise where the people taking the survey own the survey themselves. And the facilitators or the consultants are basically midwives helping bring their map into being, right? Whereas with SNA, there is more a sense of expertise, I think, and a more sense of the hierarchy because it was developed in more hierarchical systems. So I think that's important. And I think the focus on the network dynamics is right on. The one thing that I do want to say is that SNA, people are experimenting with collecting data from a lot of different places. So doing, email scraping and getting information that way. There's controversy within folks who do SNA about the effectiveness of that. And I personally much prefer ones that focus on the human side. So I wouldn't want to make that a differentiator or use that in our definition. Maybe it's more that SNA plays around with various ways of collecting data, whereas social system mapping always focuses on the humans as the source for the data collection, direct human contact.
I think another piece that Jim, what you said that made me want to say or realize I just left out was that also I think a difference is that it's centering on getting the data from the humans, and it's centering on the people in the network owning it and increasing their agency. It's also very much a learning journey, a collective learning journey for everyone in the system that is meant to help them increase their understanding both of themselves as a network and of network dynamics as well as of systemic dynamics. So understand themselves as a system and understand systems in general more, and using the context of the systems that they're embedded in, using that as a learning journey so that they deepen their understanding of that over time and collectively with each other, so that they not only have more insight, but they have a shared language around that insight, and they have shared understanding of some actual systems that they then can live into with more intelligence and more adaptive action. And so the goal is not to discern some statistics at the moment, but to evolve everybody into a wiser, more healthily connected network space. And I'm not seeing.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think another thing in there is that what SSM has the capability of doing right now, mostly through sumApp, is of showing progression and having live maps. It does exist with a few SNA tools, but they're not widely used. And so more SNA is more of a snapshot in time. So it gives you a picture, you can draw some conclusions, you can make meaning based on that picture, but it doesn't get at the ongoing evolution that you can get from a social system map.
Sarah, would you like to say what you're chatting out loud?
Well, I don't know. Actually, what Maya just said was like the thing that just kind of like hit home for me. The snapshot in time versus the evolution, I think, was helpful. But I was just listening to us all talk, right? And I was just kind of like trying to figure out what the difference is, right? And I was hearing that, like, yeah, like there is something here about like the layers and the dimensions that we are trying to reduce and trying to get a greater understanding. But then also, like, that's important in this distinction is how the map is then used. And it goes to the learning piece. It goes to like, empowering members to use it for themselves. It goes to not just looking for an answer, but looking to explore as well. Like that to me is kind of what I was hearing emerge from this conversation in terms of what's different.
Yeah.
Well, what I also heard though is Maya saying that, in both cases, you're looking at the map so that somebody can see the system. And you can expose that to everybody with an SNA map so that everybody sees the system. And that moves people. Anytime you see the system, see yourself embedded in the system, it moves you in a different way, or it moves you. The question is, in my mind, is if you've got an agent-focused map where you're really looking at the agency, does that move the system differently than if you are looking at primarily the network dynamics? And I think it does. I think that may be one of the key differences. The other thing I was going to say is, my introduction to network stuff is clearly from the SNA side, from a network reasoning perspective. And there was almost no focus on agency. It was really about looking at the network dynamics and what could you reason about that. And then when you looked at whole populations, did it fit the mathematical models where you predicted what would happen? And which is super cool, but it's really different.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's different. Yep.
I was just going to ask you one question that you can answer later is, so in what ways can we use the SNA metrics that come out of Kumu in unbounded maps? So for example, we look at in degree, how many people are being mentioned by somebody else, and we look at out degree, we look at betweenness, and we sort of say, yeah, you see something going on here. But the caveat is that participation in the map is really uneven. So you may get, when I set up a map and somebody comes on and they're gangbusters, their out degree is huge compared to everybody else because they've just mapped themselves to everybody in the network. And then, half the other people are just lurking. So you get a really distorted view if you're using some of those measures. But what measures can we use?
Okay, so there was something I was going to say in response to what you said before, Jim, and now I think I've lost it because I got attached to what you were just talking about. All right, if it comes...
metrics.
No, before that, what were you saying?
Focus on structure, network dynamics rather than agency.
Yes. Okay. That is what I wanted to say. That's been a part of how SNA has evolved, but it's not how it needs to be. So, for example, there are ways of using SNA that are very much about collective and collective meaning making. And I think in many ways that can be extremely powerful in how I love to use the maps, but it hasn't been the history of SNA. So just wanted to put that out there. In terms of the metrics, I think that's really what I was struggling a lot with when talking with this person, because we saw exactly what you're describing, Jim. We saw like a ton of in degree in one place, we got a ton of out degree in another place, but we had no way of saying, does this actually mean something beyond there were some people who were more diligent about completing the survey than others, or there's some who completed it while others didn't at all. And so I'd love to hear, Christine, your take on this one around what metrics you can actually use with some validity and reliability.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of for me is like when we use the word validity, I'm like, I don't know what that means. Like, it's what's valid is I can see these things, these facts, and nothing more.
Right.
And so to me, valid means these are the facts that we can see, and that's it. So beyond that, I'm totally inept or mystified. But to that end, to what you're talking about uneven participation, Jim, when in our maps, we don't use in degree or out degree, we use size, because size just tells us how many neighbors does the person have. And so whether it's in or out, if it's like in this group here, we would all have a size of 4 because we each have ourselves and we each know the other. And it wouldn't matter if Lisa didn't take it, I would have said, I know Lisa. I mean, if any of us took it, we would have, okay, I'm getting complex. But the point is, whether I said I knew you or you said you knew me, it's just, I have one neighbor. And so that, it doesn't tell us, I mean, if we put the arrows in, I mean, we keep the arrows in, but we size just by size, so we can see already if there are people whose arrows are only going out or only going into them. They didn't answer. So we know that they didn't answer. So this is not an accurate reflection of how many people in the network they know, but it is a reflection of how many people who took the survey said they know them. I mean, it does tell us all of these people we can see here, this many of them know that person. So we can start to see who among those who have responded. I mean, I just tend to look at who's responded. I don't worry about who hasn't responded, because if they haven't responded, there's some degree of further out from the people who have responded, and that may tell us a lot that we need to find a way of including them, but it doesn't, all it tells us is that they're not on there. So I don't think about them. I think about who's on there, and who of those who are on there are more highly connected and who are have higher betweenness. And really, there's so many other dimensions going on in a social system map that those are the two that have ever felt relevant to the members of the network, the people who are looking at the map. Usually the people who are looking at the map are looking to use it as a directory to find somebody with a certain set of specifications, or they're looking at it like someone like Sarah might look at it for persons who can play certain roles. But that's more about looking at them from a multitude of dimensions and not just running one set of statistics. One set of statistics wouldn't give her that, or one number wouldn't give her that. She would have to look at, among the various other dimensions of who's working on what, or the states they're in, or the other various pieces of them. So I don't feel like I feel like there's a way that this whole discussion is a discussion that I'm not qualified to be part of. I mean, like I have a lot of thoughts about mapping and about agency and about using them, but the statistical part has always felt like, oh yeah, that's really cool in that context, but it doesn't fit here. So I'm not spending a lot of energy, and I'm not promoting. I never tell people statistics. I never say you'll get statistics, but they want them nonetheless. And so for me, that's what's always been challenging is, so I don't feel like I'm answering it very well, except that size and betweenness are relevant generally and useful, but only to the degree that they're reflecting who has responded.
What you said there, Christine, really triggered something for me, because I think, to the extent that we have ran some of that analysis and looked at those metrics in our map,
Mm-hmm.
it is to almost give us a jumping off point.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always the right answer, right? So we'll start running some of those analysis, and we'll see some of the names pop up, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then that makes us curious then, right? Oh, why did this person come up? And so then we might dig into more on that person, and then there's other information that we pull that then lead us to take some sort of action around it. And it, like you said, it wasn't we ran size and this person was the biggest person, so okay, we're definitely going to use them. No, it was a combination of things. And then, when we went and looked at their profile of information that they filled out, it was oh yeah, now this really makes sense, based on everything else we know, that allowed us to take a move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Or go ahead, Lisa. Go ahead.
Well, it sounds like you're just still, I'm jumping on, because first of all, I have to say this has been really great education for me, because I do not know SNA. But the thing that I have a question about is how does this help us raise the questions that we want to keep learning from the map?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you connect? And it could be an SNA or SSM. This is kind of what I'm learning about each of them, but it's more about a closure of, oh, here's just what we're seeing and we're running stats, but what questions? So I'm just jumping on what you're saying, Sarah. That's really resonating for me too, is what can help us show us something initially so it can keep us asking questions and being curious about things. so that we keep going on the learning journey.
So what, just this, and I think Maya might have a better answer, but I just want to say this one thing, which is that another piece that adding to what Sarah was saying is a thing that often sort of just organically happens is that people will start to look at the different dimensions. So maybe it's different, say people have all said, you know, the issue areas that they're working on, and we might start to look at, okay, how connected are the people who are working on this issue area, and then filter on the people who are working on that area, that issue area, and see that, oh yeah, these people are really well connected, but these people aren't really well connected within a similar issue area, or within whatever other, you know, for Sarah's map, the Minnesotans are really well connected, but I think it was there's another state in her map where they're just not so very connected. There may be, you know, for the number of people, the ratio of connections just is much smaller. So what's going on in Minnesota that is not going on in that other state to help develop the relational network? So those kinds of things, but those are just really simple. They're not eigenvectors or centralities. They're just really simple, just filter, count, look, and then you can see how the different dimensions within the system are, you know, if you look dimensionally, where there's strong connections and where there aren't, and think about what could be done there. Yeah.
Great. So there's so much here that I want to respond to, and Lisa's question is also hanging that I would love to get back to. But there are a few things. First is, I think part of the challenge that folks have with working with the SSM is the relationship with Kumu, which of course is a wonderful relationship, and Kumu offers the option to do an ONA. So they give you an ONA format, you can run your data through it, and then they'll spit out all of the statistics for you. Mm-hmm. And those may or may not be helpful. So I think, you know, this is part of the, you know, people experimenting and not knowing, you know, what's really helpful and what isn't. So, and then the other thing I wanted to follow on with, as Sarah was saying, is that a good social network map also uses metrics to ask questions. And, you know, basically how I talk to people when I talk about the social network analysis is that the map is not the terrain, right? The map gives you a sense of, you know, where are the turnpikes, you know, where are the parkways, where are the, you know, the residential areas, but it doesn't give you the same experience of being on the ground in that place. And so what it allows us to do is ask questions. And sometimes the maps, the visualizations, help us ask interesting questions by seeing patterns. Sometimes the numbers, the statistics help us ask questions. But really what it's all about is about using that to ask different questions than we might have even thought of before we did the SNA, to have conversations and make collective meaning. So I don't want SNA to be affiliated with, you know, the sort of this is it, you know, set in stone metric. That the metrics are also opportunities for asking questions.
You know, something that occurs to me also is just where you were going there, Maya, about the on-the-ground view, the parametric view from the locality versus the up view. Both of them, when you map, SSM and SNA, give you a way of seeing the system that you didn't have before.
Yeah.
But the up in your face local view is much more agenic based. And the other view, the top view, allows people in a different power bracket to make changes at a different systemic level. So basically, if you provide this view that's not agenic, you really can't see the human interaction that well, but you do see the network dynamics, and you're talking to management. Management's got this power position where they can go ahead and say, yeah, let's go ahead and let's merge these two groups. Let's go ahead and create an activity that creates relationships that weren't there before, because now these people have to interact. I mean, you're doing two different things. You're actually changing the system, from 2 points of view, either from the bottom or from the top. So, and I'm not trying to make that like a binary. I'm just saying that in general, you can use, I mean, you could probably do the same thing from a management perspective and the power that's wielded by talking about human capital. You could look at the social system map and you say, people are not engaged, their relationships are very weak or whatever. And so we're going to go ahead and do something large at a systemic level that starts to change the culture.
Right.
But I think they're really, really different entry points into the system.
So, Maya, when we began this conversation, you said something about, the beauty of something like sumApp is that it's available to everybody, but the challenge then of something like sumApp is that it's available to everybody, and I understand that there's some kind of tension in what that means. And I feel like that's the piece that I'm still not really clear about. Like, what is the actual hazard? I mean, like, I get that they are different approaches. I mean, they're different. The difference between everybody having access and, getting to go in and make a big fat mess for themselves versus an expert who can guide a process and who has that level of expertise and knowledge to bring to the process. I understand that that's kind of the core difference is, one is this, everybody can play and make a mess and maybe think that they're discovering something that probably isn't true, versus an expert guiding an orderly, proven process. So I get there's that distinction, and I guess what's not clear to me is what is as long as, I mean, I think, so it's, in my mind, what's wrong with the possible messy process is if people think that they're going to get an orderly, expert-driven, scientific process, and what they get is a messy process, then their expectations aren't met, and they could potentially be really pissed off. But aside from that, I don't know what other hazards there are, what other dangers there are.
Yeah, I think that's one of the major hazards. I think what I worry about is in the promises that are made and the expectations. So it's partially the difference between a more, messy, organic, evolving process and a more structured process. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also around being able to promise that we will be able to create, definitive conclusions about your social system based on this map, and we will be able to give you metrics that you will then use to be able to track the evolution. And I think those things are not necessarily true. I mean, it can be if you get, if you're really clear. I think people don't even understand the initial question of bounded versus unbounded populations. Mm-hmm. And so you just walk in and you say, yeah, I'm going to do an organization network analysis for you. And it'll be just like this one I read about in Harvard Business Review, and it's going to give you everything you need, right? And what they don't realize is that there's tremendous value in SSM, but they can't promise the same things. And they're preparing their clients for a process the clients aren't going to get. Mm-hmm. And it leads the clients feeling frustrated. And it also leads I think the consultant or the person who's leading this effort with oh, shoot, what did I do? I messed this up and I'm inadequate kind of feeling. So those are some of the dangers that I'm seeing.
Is anybody talking about this anywhere else?
Well, something that it's kind of related to that it's sparking for me is, we're talking in this context, I guess, about networks, right? And I just don't think that we have great evaluation tools for networks in general, right? Like, we do want these numbers and these traditional metrics as we have, have a lot of comfortability with and feel like confident about. But in reality, like networks are just so complex and these living organisms that I just don't feel like we've put our finger on that. And I feel like this is sort of an extension of that, right? Like we want the SNA because we want to just know the answer, but really that there isn't an answer necessarily. It's a little bit more complex than that.
I'm actually, this is like unformed for me, but so one of the things I've been doing slowly is getting certified in a coaching system methodology that, looks at teams and groups as systems, and it's coaching to that, and it's principles based. So the way you help people start to see the system are different ways. But I'm just wondering too, as I try to what really struck Maya, what you said is, you can't it's hard to prepare clients for something that they're not going to get. So how do you help people along the way of understanding that? And I do think there's certain very tangible things we can start doing to show people that they are in a system and that there are these invisible dynamics that happen and invisible layers of complexity. It's something I've been working on in my own trainings, is to help people see that, start to see that slowly and understand it. And I think that there's some connection that we can do around when we're introducing social systems mapping that connects to that. And it's just like, it's like they're not going to understand all of it, but they might be able to understand parts of what it means. This training I'm doing comes from family systems dynamics, and we all have, things like that we can relate to. And I realize this is kind of relating more to the dynamics part of what you're talking about that might be more SNA even related. But I wonder if that helps them start to see the layers of complexity. It's just sort of random out loud thoughts I'm having that I don't know if there's any connections or not, but it's stuff I'm thinking about as I hear you all.
I actually think there is, and I really like that, Lisa, because I think that's part of the challenge that we're running into, is that SSM is a systems tool. It's about looking at a system. And yet people aren't used to thinking about systems. They are used to thinking in, linear Newtonian ways.
Exactly.
And building on what Sarah said, they're also desperate for measures and metrics. I mean, particularly in the nonprofit effort, we want to know that what we're doing is making a difference. So here's something that looks like it could help us with that problem, right? So let's slap it on and make it happen. But we are using it in a different context. We're not using it the way that it is meant to be used, which is in a systemic frame and for systemic purposes. So I really like that idea of just looking at helping people shift their thinking to more of a system view. So I got excited about that. Thank you.
And the thing it brings up for me is, when we introduce SSM to folks, the immediate benefit they get is they can contact people, I can see their affinities and so forth. I don't think they're thinking about it as a way of seeing themselves within the system or seeing the system in totality. I think seeing the system, is a new way of seeing for people. And there's a million ways to do it. A lot of tools, to give you some view of the system that you don't have, give you an on the balcony view rather than on the floor view. But I think that's in itself is a big thing, right? Fifth discipline, Peter Senge saying one of the 5 things you must do is see the system, and Otto Scharmer, turning the lens back on yourself. And it's like, that's the new cutting edge. And yet we're not even really clear about what we're seeing when we see the system, if you're training up a new group of people. So to make this distinction between how you see the system with SNA versus the aspects of SSM that are seeing the system, and the shift within where you go from, I just know who these people are and how to contact them, to, oh, I'm starting to see the system and the patterns here. Wow, this is rich. So Maya, how are you using SNA kind of work coming from that perspective and doing what you said, which is to drive people, the participants, into seeing themselves as a collective?
Yeah, well, I think one of the first things is that when sharing maps, I never ever share them initially with the names on them. And so the first piece is not, look at where you are on the map or find out how you're connected. The first thing is, let's look at what this map is telling us overall. When you look at it, where are the concentration of nodes? How are the nodes spread apart or positioned close to each other? I'll also give them overlays by geography or hierarchical level or function or subject matter expertise, and say, what patterns can we see now that we are seeing these different elements? So it's all around getting people to put on their analysis hats and to look at data and find patterns in it. So it's different from seeing themselves as part of the system, right? They are sitting back and looking at a system there. They do happen to be part of that system, but they're not, it's different. But it's a starting place. And it's a starting place that most people get excited about and can get engaged in. And from there, we can go to some more of the individual level. But I think, and through also group activities, then we can get to seeing selves as a system, but that's a harder reach for them. Starting off with an image and analyzing that's usually an easy first step for them. Did that answer the question, Jim?
Yeah, I think that was good.
Okay.
Kicking it.
That also strikes me as a really useful way of, I mean, that first layer without names seems like a really useful helping for people's shifting. I mean, what we find is the first thing we're interested in is myself on the map, and I see an evolution out from there, but helping to move through that evolution. I think what you're talking about would help move to move through that evolution faster or differently. That would be useful.
What's the last thing you said, Maya? So look at the system, then see themselves within the system. And then was the last thing you said, then moving them to some kind of action at a personal level? Or what was the last thing?
Yeah, I mean, but I think the piece that I was trying to pull out, and also I just want to note we're getting close to our time boundary, is that the piece that they're not, I don't usually get with them. Sometimes I do, but often I don't, through an SNA, is helping them understand the system dynamics in the room, the system dynamics that they're in the moment, right? So they've got this piece of paper and they can see the system there, right? And then they can, after we go through and look at the pattern, say, oh, there I am. And let me look at, how I'm focusing here. But getting to what Lisa was talking about and some of the work I've been doing lately on helping folks see systems, they're not looking at a room and being able to say within the room, how am I acting as a voice of the system right now? What is the system expressing in this moment that needs to be expressed? So that it's the whole group expression of systems does not come out usually.
But I'm not sure we get that with an SSM either. I
don't know that we do either.
I think the interpersonal dynamics is more like Otto's social field.
Yeah.
How do you sense what's going on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I do think, I mean, that was a piece that Lisa brought up that I think is something that's really missing in all of this, is that we're giving people system tools, but we're helping them get them up here, but we're not getting them to make that deeper transition to thinking in system ways and seeing themselves as an ongoing part of systems.
I think this is the piece that I was going to go to Berlin with the summer school with Theory U to work on, is how can you use network lens to look at that piece? And I don't have a very good idea of that right now.
So it's 10 o'clock,
So cool.
or it's the end of the hour. Should we just, any last words, any closing, want to say one closing word, or? should we just end?
This is a great
I-
conversation.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons that I wanted to join with you folks,
Yeah.
is to have these
I'm-
conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have this conversation. And Jim, there's lots of trailblazers who've been working on how to help people see
Yeah.
themselves as systems, lots of methodologies out there. So just wanted to put that out there, and maybe that's
Yeah.
something we can follow up on if people are interested.
I would
on
love to
Slack.
too. I'll put the CRR Global because they're in your backyard, Jim, too, that you might be interested. The organizational relationship system coaching.
Yeah.
Of course, folks, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah, do you have any last thing?
Yeah. No, I really enjoyed this. I felt like this was kind of, this was such a good use of my Monday morning. So thank you so much, Maya. And I hope we can have more conversations like this.
Yes,
Yeah.
y quizás en español a veces. Mhm.
Oh, por
Great.
supuesto.
And are we all going to try to be here next week to